Dear colleagues, dear guests, Your Excellencies, it's a big pleasure and honor for us here today to start our international conference, the exchange of information between humanitarian organizations operating in Ukraine, which is held jointly by the Embassy of the Sovereign Order of Malta to Ukraine and the Institute of International Relations of Tarasa Shevchenka National University of Kyiv. Thank you very much for all being here, for your attendance, for your kind support and participation in our conference. And to start with, we have several opening addresses. And the first opening address, opening speech, will be given by Professor Valery Kopyka, Director of the Institute of International Relations of Tarasa Shevchenka National University of Kyiv.
Thank you very much. Dear colleagues, distinguished guests, Your Excellencies, on behalf of the Institute of International Relations of Tarasa Shevchenka National University of Kyiv, I want to express our warm welcome to all the guests and participants of the international conference, the exchange of information between humanitarian organizations operating in Ukraine. It is a great pleasure and honor to hold this conference together with the Embassy of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta to Ukraine. And it is our second conference within 6 months held in cooperation with the Embassy, and we are grateful to the Embassy and His Excellency, Mr. Ambassador, for the opportunity to hold joint conference dedicated to important questions and issues of humanitarian activity and humanitarian relief. Today's conference is dedicated to the issue of exchange of information between humanitarian organizations operating in Ukraine. This issue is of particular importance for Donbass, where people need assistance and relief to secure their basic needs. We hope that our conference will become an important input to the important issue of cooperation and exchange of information between humanitarian organizations operating in Ukraine. I wish you a good and fruitful work, dear colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Director. The next opening address goes to His Excellency Monsignor Vasil Totchapets, Archiepiscopal Exarch of Ukraine and Greek Catholic Archiepiscopal Exarchate of Kharkiv.
Шановні представники різних гуманітарних організацій,
Dear representatives of all the international organizations,
Екселенції Нунції Клаудіо Виджероті, представники різних також посольств,
Your Excellency, the nuncios and the representatives of the embassies,
різних також церковних, релігійних спільнот,
of the church and religious communities,
і всі присутні на цій конференції.
and all guests present here at this conference.
Питання гуманітарної допомоги безпосередньо є пов'язане з людською гідністю.
The issue of humanitarian help is directly communicated with the issue of the human dignity.
І ця цінність людини, гідності людини, відповідальність за цю цінність несе ціле суспільство.
And the responsibility for this dignity lies on the whole humankind.
В особливій мірі також і церква.
Mostly on the church itself.
Адже одною з головних складових природи церкви є саме служіння милосердя.
As one of the main parts of the church essence is the service for the humankind.
Тому наша церква також, усвідомлюючи відповідальність перед українським суспільством, також виконує цю місію милосердя в Україні.
And our church, understanding this responsibility, is taking up this mission for Ukraine.
Виконує її особливо через благодійну організацію Caritas Україна.
The organization Caritas Ukraine is one of the instruments to provide this mission.
яка входить в міжнародну благодійну організацію католицької церкви Caritas,
which is a part of the international Catholic organization Caritas.
але хочу сказати, що не тільки Caritas також займається цією благодійною допомогою.
But I would like to emphasize that it's not only Caritas that deal with international humanitarian help.
Є також різні комісії нашої церкви, які в вужчому напрямку займаються також, надають допомогу потребуючим.
There are also different councils of our church with which locally deal with the problems and help people.
Скажімо, комісія «Справедливість і мир», вона також займається соціальними питаннями, зокрема протидії корупції.
For example, the Council Justice and Peace also deals with the humanitarian issues, such as, for example, anti-corruption.
Комісія Душпастерства охорони здоров'я займається допомогою також в реабілітації, проведення комплексної реабілітації потребуючим.
The Clergy Council on Health Protection also deals with the issues of rehabilitation of patients.
Тому наша церква, розуміючи, що не можна лише на Карітасі зупинити чи залишити всю відповідальність цієї місії милосердя, створила також окремий відділ соціального служіння церкви.
And understanding that only Caritas cannot be the full help to people, we also created the special social service of the church,
який займається координацією повністю всього соціального служіння нашої церкви.
Which completely deals with the issue of social service in the area of our church.
Сьогодні на цій конференції буде представлено Caritas, представники нашого Caritasу представлять, як Caritas допомагає під час цієї кризи, яка спричинена війною на Донбасі.
At this conference, the representatives of the Caritas organization will explain how Caritas helps people in the crisis which occurred.
Але це є одна лише з частин цієї місії, яку церква наша виконує.
But it is only a small part of a mission which our church deals with.
Я також вітаю всіх представників гуманітарних організацій, які надають місію, які надають цю допомогу потребуючим.
I also express my gratitude to all the representatives of the humanitarian organizations which provide this support.
Хай Господь благословить всіх тих, які допомагають потребуючим.
May God bless all the people who help the needing.
І нехай також ця конференція послужить тим, щоб ми ще більше могли ефективніше і більше і краще могли допомогти людям, які є в потребі.
And let this conference be an instrument which will help us to support more people in the future.
Дуже дякуємо, Ваше Високопресвященство. Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for this kind address. And the next floor goes for the opening speech of His Excellency, Ambassador of Sovereign Order of Malta to Ukraine, Antonio Gazzanti Pugliese di Cotrone.
Thank you, Professor Kopica, for your kind words and for your fruitful collaboration, above all. And thank you for your presence and your collaboration. The Sovereign Order of Malta, through its members, its volunteers, and its specialized medical and paramedical staff, develops and implements a wide range of medical, social, and humanitarian projects literally all over the world. It always turns its attention towards the weakest without making a distinction regarding the religion, race, and political orientation. Among them are the victims of natural disasters and of armed conflicts, and in particular, the refugees, the homeless, the poor people, the elderly, the children, disabled persons. The wars, the persecution, and the poverty force the population to migrate more and more, or even to escape, to be found often in conditions of extreme discomfort. Even in this phase that often masks terrible trips, the Order of Malta is here with its assistance in the camps. I will restrict myself to two examples only. Our hospital in the camp in Kilis, on the border with Turkey, which accepts refugees from Syria, and our rescue teams in the southern Mediterranean, which assist the migrant arriving by the sea from North Africa. The Order is increasingly involved in the development of the culture of prevention, with the reference to the victims of the natural disasters. The goal is to reduce the risks of natural disaster by providing the details of the escape routes for the highest risk categories, such as the elderly and disabled people, among other preventive measures. The emergency activity of the Order includes that in Nepal, after the disaster earthquakes, in the Philippines, affected by the typhoon Haiyan, in the Horn of Africa as a consequence of the famine, in Haiti, and more generally in Europe and in Asia with respect to extreme meteorological conditions. Another field to which the Order of Malta is strongly committed is the fundamental human right of the health care. With its mobile clinics, its hospitals, and its reception centers, the Order reaches the weakest, the most marginalized, and the most isolated people. I would like to mention in this regard the assistance that was given to the prisoners in the prisons of Nairobi, Africa. The 28 medical facilities in Lebanon assisting the local population and refugees, the Bethlehem Hospital, and the mobile clinic in the West Bank. Yet another battlefield to which the Order has been committed for over 50 years is against so-called pathology of poverty. Leprosy that spreads in environments characterized by extreme poverty, malnutrition, overcrowding, drought, and the absence of medical care. In this field, our research and rehabilitation programs are active in Africa, Southeast Asia, and South America. The Order assistance structures are also constantly fighting against the serious epidemics of such disease as tuberculosis, malaria, HIV, especially in Africa. Finally, there are a lot of programs of support and integration for ethnic minorities, drug addicts, and more generally for those living in the margins of society. Noteworthy. Among these are the intervention of the Order in favor of the Dalit ethnic group in India, the Roma community in many European countries, and some communities in Burkina Faso. In addition, I would mention the social canteens by which the Order manages to help the poorest in many countries. A big part of this activity of support and emergency are carried out by the Order through our agency of assistance, the International Malteser and its local branches. So, it becomes essential to make an introductory reference to the Ukrainian Malteser Relief, which has been operating in the Ukrainian territory since 1991. There will be a way to continue speaking about some of its activities in detail. The most recent initiatives to mention since 2007 are the HELP project towards boarding schools and orphanages, renovating bedrooms, kitchens, bathrooms, classrooms, libraries, etc. The project St. Nicholas Goes to Orphanages, with the organization of parties, activities, and presents for poor children. The project Help for Self-Help, focused on teaching young people a job. The work with disabled people via summer camps and pilgrimage trips. The program supporting family child care homes, aimed on the help offered to the families with a large number of children. In 2015, the project First Aid, to spread, especially among the young people, the culture of the first aid with the support of medical personnel and volunteers. In 2016, the program for the social and psychological help for the east of Ukraine being held in Irpin, Borispil, Kyiv, Sloviansk, Mariupol, Severodonetsk. The Malteser has operated via involvement of 86 people to provide a psychotherapy support to a total amount of about 4,000 refugees. Many other national and international organizations are carrying out highly qualified and professional humanitarian and emergency work in Ukraine as well. It must possess the ability to make such involvement highly flexible and easily adaptive to the changing needs. In this context, the issue of the information exchange between all the operators in the fields becomes crucial. It, in our opinion, must ground on the following principle. In particular, it must provide complete, full, and transparent involvement of the competent Ukrainian authorities at both the central and local levels. It must never affect or compromise in any way the independence and autonomous responsibility of each operating structure. It must promote the capacity and the quality of the operation. It must stimulate, in a context of a critical and flexible mentality, the experimentation of the most suitable behavior with the aim to find effective organizational solutions. It must be abreast with the need for continuous updating of the procedures. It must help to create networks of information and monitoring that involve also the affected population. It must be aimed not only at collecting, but also at interpretation of the information and to consent also in a preventive functions the simulation of the events. It must aim at the interconnection of different specific skills. It must realize a vertical and horizontal information exchange. It must contribute to a more complete and better training of volunteers. But in an efficient exchange of information must also be based on a simple, immediate, and technologically advanced communication capability. It will be necessary to identify, first of all, the manager of a communication for each operator, and to use the most innovative and the least expensive techniques of the conveyance of information. It is possible to imagine the following solutions. The web platforms based on technologies to collect and to integrate data from various sources, including geographical information systems, semi-structured information, monitoring data, etc. App for smartphones to create a network between operators and citizens to increase the exchange of the information in case of the interventions of emergency. Link with the technology open source to facilitate the sharing of information not only for emergency, but also for the strategic planning and the preventions management, facilitating an access to complete data sets with almost increasing levels of knowledge and awareness of interventions. At the same time, it will be necessary to identify a standardization of the information paths and full sharing of procedures. In the case when this platform of information exchange could be fulfilled on a satisfactory productive level, the second evolutionary phase will follow, of general planning and the realization of synergies in these sectors. But this is beyond the topic of the present conference, and I am also aware that the steps, especially really constructive ones, must be made one at a time. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for this, I would say, program opening speech relating to exchange of information in humanitarian field, and for all the support and assistance which the Order and the Malteser International give to Ukrainian people in need. Thank you very much. We also have another opening speech which is not here scheduled in program, but which we deem is important, and which will be given by Mr. Boris Babin, permanent representative of the President of Ukraine in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea.
Thank you. Dear guests, distinguished excellencies and professors, I am grateful, and on behalf of mission of President of Ukraine in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, I want to thank all international entities for its aid as humanitarian so in issues of security and human rights devoted of occupied territories of Ukraine, including Crimea. We may point now that some international units in their activities on the controlled part of Ukraine is a huge tool of aid to persons who are victims of this conflict. And first of all, I want to mention and thank the Special Monitoring Mission of Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, as its Kherson office is very active in those issues, and we hope that their activity will be reflected in the OSCE acts. Also, I want to thank the mission of monitoring of human rights of UN, who is also one of the most important of today's structures for helping Crimeans today, and also mentioning UN. Special rapporteurs visiting Ukraine open invitation made our government in 2014 is also very important, as for example only these 2 months two special monitoring mission visited us. It's a special rapporteur in issues of tortures and special rapporteur in issues of internal debt and human rights, and their interest to Crimean problems and problems of Crimean residents is also very important for us. Also, we may thank the European Union as for help and projects related to the internal depleted persons from Crimea, and it is important for us. And also the Council of Europe in the newly established plan of aid of Ukraine foresees some projects related to the internally displaced persons, and we are glad that in this plan it will cover not only Donbass but Crimea also. It's a huge step forwards. Also, we may point the activities of International Committee of Red Cross, of its Odessa and Kyiv offices, which also make attempts to help us internally displaced persons, so to the national structures of Red Cross in regions attached to the front line with Crimea. It's very important for us. LS Simferopol office of International Committee of Red Cross, which is part of Moscow delegation, makes some other policy, and we have some question for it, as it is maybe not in strict compliance with International Red Cross Committee high-level standards. Anyway, we hope that in future also other humanitarian entities, of course including Maltese Order, will be a good support as for internally displaced persons from Crimea, so for persons coming temporarily from Peninsula, as we may now fix that some urgent issues related to Crimean residents, including the checkpoints problems, and including the issues of administrative services establishment in the mainland part of Ukraine for them, have no any as technic, neither technic nor humanitarian aid, neither from international structures nor from international government representatives. And we hope it is temporal situation and it will be changed. And of course, the humanitarian aid from international structures, their support, will be a very important tool of defense the human rights of residents of Crimea as on Peninsula, so in the mainland part of Ukraine. And I want to thank everybody for attention to humanitarian issues in our country. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Babin, for your opening address and for all the work which is done for Crimea, for people of Crimea, people of Ukraine who are in this situation and who need support. Dear colleagues, our opening addresses are now finished, and we start to work with our panel 1, which is named Humanitarian Activity and its Peculiarities in Ukraine. But before opening this panel, I would like to mention that our conference is now streamed online. The link to our stream can be found on the Facebook site of our institute, so everybody in the world, in particular in Rome, can see this conference online. And to start our first panel, it is a big pleasure to give the floor to Mr. Serhiy Petukhov, Deputy Minister of Justice of Ukraine for European Integration, with a topic on the Ministry of Justice of Ukraine's position on humanitarian relief. Mr. Petukhov.
Thank you, Anton. Excellencies, colleagues, good morning to all of you. Happy to see familiar faces. And indeed, the topic of today's meeting is quite important and I think that the Ministry of Justice involvement is central to coordinating the efforts of the government in the area of human rights generally, and in particular with respect to the humanitarian situation in the occupied parts of Ukraine. The Ministry of Justice has the general coordinating role in the human rights, which means that we have a Directorate for Human Rights, and we are the central inflow of the information and activities of the government in the area of human rights. The Directorate has been recently established, and we are still getting to build up our authority and competence to have the central role, sort of a horizontal relation to whatever the other agencies do, in order to have a consolidated approach to the various questions that often arise unexpectedly. Ukraine implements the National Human Rights Strategy, which has a big part of it in a separate chapter related to the situation at the occupied territory and human rights violations that are related to the situation. We are aware of many problems that our people are facing at the occupied territories. We are also aware and understanding that Ukraine was not prepared to the aggression in 2014 and had no immediate solutions to the humanitarian crisis that followed that aggression. We're aware that we're still not completely self-sufficient and will probably not be self-sufficient for a while in dealing with the humanitarian situation in Donbas and Crimea. Therefore, it is important that we have the support of our international partners. And from my perspective, what we have to do is to firstly ensure that they have unimpeded access to the territory of Ukraine, to the people in need. And I think we've been doing that to a reasonable extent, the cooperation has been quite good. We're of course not satisfied with the access to the occupied territories. We know that many of the humanitarian actors face problems with the access, so that's something that remains our concern, and that's something where we draw in attention of the international community to. International organizations have no access to Crimea at all. The access to occupied part of Donbas is quite limited and is marred by the security threats. Also, what we have to do as a state, and the Ministry of Justice in particular, we have to ensure that the humanitarian aid is inflowing without unjustified delay, that it is distributed transparently and reaches the people in need. And here we, of course, I can publicly admit, have lots of questions and problems. Unfortunately, many of the humanitarian organizations come to us and our colleagues saying that Ukraine has not been particularly paying attention to various problems or impediments that the organizations are facing. There's a question of customs control, of taxation, of transparency in the government agencies' work. There has been various even scandals and corruption allegations, not only on the government side, but also on the National Red Cross Society. We take it seriously, and I think that it is our duty to make sure that the government is efficient in this part, because whatever is done by the international actors here in Ukraine is based on a goodwill and trust and cooperation with Ukrainian authorities. I will be staying here for the coffee break, so if any of you have any problems working in Ukraine, come up to me. If I cannot help, I will at least know and direct my colleagues as to the problems that there are still existing. What is important to us, of course, is that we understand that the conflict, whenever it ends, the problems will not end on the same day. There will be a question of reintegration, the question of punishment, the questions of reconciliation of the population, of the authorities, the question of return of the people who had to move from their homes, the question of reinstating the property rights, etc. There are no simple solutions to this kind of problems. Every conflict is unique. We do not know how the conflict will end, when it will happen, and how many more deaths and other victims of the losses the Ukraine will have to suffer before it ends. But we are cooperating with our international partners and looking at international experience in order to see what solutions can work in Ukraine. We are working through the United Nations with the international community in informing the world about the situation, and unfortunately I think the information is important in the 21st century, and we see that the information that comes out of Ukraine about the conflict has been distorted, specifically distorted. There's a lot of propaganda ongoing. That's our duty to make sure that the world knows the actual situation, and here we rely on our partners who provide the independent monitoring and assessment of the information. And that's also important because sometimes when world think that it's an internal conflict or nothing is happening or it's an ethnic conflict, then the whole approach to the aggression, Russian aggression in Ukraine is distorted. So that's another thing that we in the Ministry of Justice think as important and what takes a lot of our attention. Otherwise, I will not take much time. I'm happy to answer any questions or any of your particular concerns. Please come up to us, and if you have any grievances with the Ukrainian government, let me know. I might be of a help to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Petukhov, for your speech and also for all the support and all the activity of the Ministry of Justice, which is done in the field of human rights protection, which for sure is now one of the basic needs for our country. Dear colleagues, I think we will have a place for and time for your questions, for your comments in the end of the panel. So if you have questions to Mr. Petukhov or to any other of our presenters, or if you have comments, you will be free to make your point. The next floor goes to Mr. Ivane Bochorishvili, who is Deputy Head of the United Nations Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dear colleagues, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, it is my pleasure to present the mandate of the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, as well as some of the activities which we are trying to coordinate together with the partners and the government of Ukraine. Next slide, please. Okay, so then I will try to go without presentation. I will cover basically at the general OCHA mandate, and then I will come to the specifics of activities which we are doing particularly in Ukraine. United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs and our mandate stems from the UN General Assembly Resolution 46-182 of December 1991. These are the 5 key areas where we try actually to make and add the value in terms of the humanitarian activities and the coordination. You see that some of the key areas which are related to information management, which Deputy Minister actually has briefly mentioned, advocacy, humanitarian financing and policy is kind of some of the key crucial areas for the activities which we try to bring together. In addition to that, OCHA brings together humanitarian actors to ensure a coherent and principled response to emergencies. The aim is to assist people when they most need relief or protection. And this happens complementary to the government actions and always in coordination with the government and as well as the oblast authorities. The humanitarian coordination seeks to improve the effectiveness of humanitarian response by ensuring the greater predictability, accountability, and partnership. Coordination involves assessing situations and needs, agreeing common priorities, developing common strategies to address issues such as negotiating humanitarian access, mobilizing funding and other resources, clarifying consistent public messaging and monitoring progress. Throughout the process, information sharing and management is central and critical. Next slide, please. In front of you, this is a very brief kind of humanitarian coordination architecture setup, which we are actually having in Ukraine. Just to mention briefly, this is kind of the coordination setup to try to coordinate the international community's efforts to develop a coordination architecture for the humanitarian system, a structure that is effective and its functions well as the representative and inclusive in its scope. A brief overview of the various coordination structures in country include the humanitarian country team, cluster coordination mechanism, civil-military coordination mechanism, area-based coordination mechanism, and general coordination mechanism. And you have the split in terms of what type of coordination setups exist at the Kiev level as well as in the field. Through this mechanism, a large volume of information and data flow is exchanged, analyzed, and made sense of not only to inform the most appropriate and effective response, but also to mobilize attention, support, and resources to the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. Next slide, please. This setup is replicatory to the global level, which has been actually mandated by the Interagency Standing Committee, and it was actually created after the tsunami response, when the results or the post-mortem of the humanitarian response showed that the humanitarian community has been very disorganized, and actually there were lots of gaps in terms of providing the humanitarian assistance timely and in a principled manner to the people. That's why the cluster system has been established afterwards, and then actually was first kind of kicked off and tried in during the response in Pakistan. In Ukraine, we have now around 6 clusters and 3 subclusters, which are trying actually to add the value in different type of sectors and provide the timely assistance to the people in need. Next slide. The humanitarian community recognizes the importance of gathering the reliable data on the locations of people in need, what they urgently need, who is best placed to assist them, and the value of this information for effective and timely humanitarian assistance. OCHA, as the Secretariat agency specializing in coordination, provides information management services to the humanitarian community to inform a rapid, effective, and principled response. We do so by adapting or creating the tools, methodologies, and processes to gather, share, and analyze the data and information to inform coordination, decision-making, and advocacy. On a monthly basis, OCHA office in Ukraine collects and analyzes information to provide an overview of the crisis. OCHA's information products include maps, graphics, situation reports, humanitarian bulletins, and so-called 3Ws, who does what where. Next slide, please. We also facilitate the humanitarian community in undertaking a consolidated, evidence-based, and prioritized response planning. Coordination and information sharing management are critical and central in information, the need and evidence response to help save lives and reduce suffering. OCHA facilitates the cross-sectoral, methodological, and impartial assessments of needs across all areas in Eastern Ukraine. This is done through collection and collation of both secondary and primary data. There were 72 assessments done by different agencies and sectors across Ukraine, majority in the 2 conflict areas oblasts. This is why information so vital, and that mainly took place in 2017. Information on the needs, vulnerabilities, and capacities of affected people based on secondary and primary data derived from multiple sources is systematically analyzed and amalgamated into the humanitarian needs overview. The humanitarian needs overview identifies immediately emergency needs and key humanitarian issues and provides an analysis of severity of need that provides evidence-based analysis for the humanitarian response. Another critical element is producing evidence for decision-making on strengthening humanitarian response, addressing shortcomings, and adjusting the response as when necessary. Monitoring contributes to strengthening the humanitarian community's accountability towards the affected population, humanitarian counterparts, and donors. Next slide, please. The humanitarian needs overview, as you see, the cover page, which we actually come up collectively together with different agencies, is the foundation for coherent and efficient humanitarian response, and it provides actually the strong evidence base for our strategic objectives, as well as the planning for the yearly basis. Next slide. Based on the humanitarian needs overview, we collectively come up with the humanitarian response plan, and which consists of country strategy and sectoral plans, and it builds upon the humanitarian needs overview, which provide the evidence base and analysis of the magnitude of the crisis and identify the most pressing and humanitarian needs in the countries. These needs basically inform the humanitarian response plan. Next slide. Another critical element which we actually try to add value is the humanitarian civil-military coordination, which is one of the core functions of OCHA. In humanitarian operations with the military presence, OCHA leads the establishment and management of interaction with military actors, and this relationship mainly will change depending on the type of emergency and the roles and responsibilities of the military. OCHA works with all actors to overcome the challenges that could arise, such a lack of humanitarian access, which can be addressed through the regular humanitarian negotiation with military actors. And as you can imagine, this has a very practical implications for Ukraine setting, and particularly in Eastern Ukraine, where we are operating. Next slide, please. We are having actually the monthly civil-military coordination meetings in different locations where different humanitarian actors providing the humanitarian response in the area are participating in order to improve and fine-tune and see actually what can be done in terms of improving the humanitarian access. Next slide, please. These are some of the broad things in terms of what we have identified as part of our needs analysis in Ukraine, and which stems out in different documents which I have been saying. The human toll of the complex armed conflict in eastern Ukraine is critical, with 95% of over 8,500 clashes occur within the 5 kilometer of the contact line, which is now, unfortunately, a de facto border separating the one territory into two. The 457 kilometer contact line saw almost 1 million individual crossings each month, despite being one of the top 3 most mine-contaminated stretches of land in the world, with 1/3 of the areas remain, unfortunately, unmarked. Near 2 million people are affected by landmines and explosive remnants of war. On one hand, the dire protracted crisis affects 4.4 million people, of whom 3.4 million require humanitarian assistance and protection. The response, on the contrary, is severely underfunded and largely forgotten by the international community. Next slide. These are some of the key messages for you to understand the consequence of this ongoing fighting and the hostilities in eastern Ukraine. 600,000 people live in areas along the contact line. On average, every day, 38 incidents of shelling and small arms fire happen. Next slide, please. You see the scale of the movement of the people along the contact line. We have actually around 1 million in average individual crossings each month through the 5 operational checkpoints in eastern Ukraine. Conditions at the checkpoints, especially in the no man's land, are the most difficult as people lack adequate access to health services, sanitation and shelter facilities. In April alone, I mean, you saw that there were 1 million individual crossings which actually faced different type of health complications whilst waiting at the contact line in order to cross the checkpoint. Next slide, please. Almost 2 million people in the government control areas alone are affected by the mines and explosive remnants of war. Last year, 238 men, women and children were killed or injured by mines or unexploded or ordnance in eastern Ukraine. In April this year, a family of 4 was killed by a landmine. Over 700 civilians have been killed and some 9,000 injured since the outbreak of hostilities in 2014. Next slide, please. Critical civilian infrastructure are targeted, starting from hospitals to schools to home and other public facilities, with 135 incidents affecting water and sanitation facilities in 2017. Critical filtration stations which supply water to millions of Ukrainians on both sides of the contact line are regularly damaged due to shelling. From January to May 2008, 48 wash incidents were reported. These incidents disrupt access to clean water of 4.8 million who are served by large-scale centralized water systems in the 2 conflict-affected oblasts. Next slide, please. Millions of conflict-affected Ukrainians are challenged when accessing healthcare, education, shelter, and livelihoods in eastern Ukraine. Food insecurity has doubled in less than 12 months last year, whilst there are 2.2 million people in eastern Ukraine who are struggling to access healthcare. Over 220,000 children live in areas regularly affected by hostilities, while 400,000 homes have been either damaged or destroyed so far. These are just some of the figures in order to illustrate the scale of the conflict, and I will be happy to answer for additional questions, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bucherishvili, for a presentation and, of course, for all the activity of FOCHA in Donbass, which, of course, is indispensable and important now for the people of Ukraine, the people of Donbass there. Dear colleagues, we are kind of sorry for this movement of students here, but we want you just to know that they have now exams or pass-fail exams credits, so that is why now it's a hot time for them. So we hope that this is not of big inconvenience for you, dear colleagues. The next speech, the next presentation goes to Mr. Jeffrey Ehrlich, who is a Senior Project Officer of OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, with the topic NGO Government Coordination on Humanitarian Mine Action.
Thank you very much, Your Excellencies, distinguished colleagues. It's too bad the students left. I was going to give them some of the answers, but their loss. Okay, I want to just, I'd like to talk about how the OSCE is assisting in the specific area of humanitarian mine action. But first, I just want to explain just a few words about the OSCE. Many of you know this, but just to situate my role and my office's role. The OSCE is an organization of 57 participating states, which meets essentially weekly in Vienna. And then the 57 participating states establish missions. In Ukraine, there are 2 missions. There's the project coordinator in Ukraine, which is my office, and there's the special monitoring mission, which Mr. Babin referred to earlier. I'm not responsible for the special monitoring mission. It's a completely independent mission from ours. As the name of the special monitoring mission implies, they primarily do monitoring, and my office primarily does projects. We follow a partnership model, meaning that every project that we do has a concrete Ukrainian partner. Usually they're government agencies, and in the case of mine action, specifically they're the Ministry of Defense, the State Emergency Service, and the Ministry of Temporary Occupied Territories and IDPs. Every project that we do also supports OSCE commitments. A commitment is something that the participating states have agreed to on a full consensus basis. So what's interesting is that once the participating states have agreed to something, it would also take all the participating states to, say, cancel that commitment. So we have commitments, many commitments that date back to 1990, and we do in fact have commitments that specifically relate to mine action and to the cleanup of unexploded ordnance and explosive remnants of war. So, and my office has been assisting actually the Ukrainian authorities for several years prior to the conflict. When the conflict started, we had already been working with the State Emergency Service and the Ministry of Defense for several years, helping them address the issue of mines and unexploded ordnance. I'm sure that all of you know that Ukraine, unfortunately, has been really the center of several world conflicts, obviously World War II. Also, Soviet-era stockpiles and Soviet-era training grounds remain, and they have hazardous explosive materials. Also, I'd like to say that when we talk about mine action, it was mentioned before, but it's not only mines. Mines are shorthand for unexploded ordnance and explosive remnants of war. So if a shell is fired, lands in the ground and doesn't explode, that's also encompassed by mine action, as are improvised explosive devices in some cases. So when we say mines, I just want to be clear that we're not always talking about intentionally laid minefields. So before the conflict, basically the way the government was working was kind of like a fire brigade would work. You know, there's an emergency situation and they respond and then they take care of the emergency. So maybe and this is common throughout Europe. I mean, you hear stories every now and then. In London, they find a bomb from World War II. It's the same thing in Ukraine. Someone's digging a basement maybe in Lviv Oblast, and they find a large round piece of metal. They call the State Emergency Service. They come and they take care of that piece of metal. But with the conflict requires a different response. The conflict requires that you clear areas or maybe survey areas, and you don't know if there's a bomb there. You don't know if there's a mine there or not. You simply don't know. There's a joke that I heard from someone at the State Emergency Service that, you know, they got a call from a farmer that that he had found a mine in his field, and the State Emergency Service comes out and they say, "Where's the mine?" And the farmer says, I forget. And why did the farmer do that? Because he wants his field cleared, right? He thinks there's a mine in the field, or he thinks there's an unexploded shell in the field, and he doesn't want to go out there and find out by driving his tractor over it or by stepping on it. So this requires a different approach. Okay, talking only about clearance, survey and clearance, we're talking about large area clearance that needs to be prioritized. Okay, so you've got two farmers. Which farmer goes first? Which farmer gets to plant this year? Which farmer has to wait 2 years to plant? What happens if the farmer steps on a mine? Who's responsible? If the farmer injures himself with his farm machinery, you know, it's probably his. I mean, I think legally it's his fault. If the farmer steps on a mine that wasn't put there by him, who's responsible for that mine? So there are all these policy decisions. How do you decide when a field has been cleared? When you call the State Emergency Service and they come and they remove that bomb, you know it's not there. You know it's not there. But if they inspect a field and then remove 10 objects from the field, maybe there's an 11th object. Maybe there's another 100 objects. So how do you decide how clear the field is? So these are policy questions that have to be addressed in the current context. I would also mention that when we talk about humanitarian mine action, of course most people think immediately of clearance, but there are in fact 5 pillars to mine action, and I just want to mention them. It's victim assistance, So who pays for the care of victims? Who compensates victims? It's mine risk education. What are the standards? There need to be standards for how you teach people how to avoid mines. Just like in I think other kind of public education areas, there should be standards, and we should make sure that, say, obviously that, say, communities that are most at risk get very solid education. There's also stockpile management. In the past year or two, there have been a couple well-known large explosions of stockpiles. Stockpiles of weapons are dangerous, right? And in some cases, we're talking about stockpiles of weapons that won't be used because they're Soviet-era stockpiles, and the munitions are actually too dangerous to move, but they have to be addressed. And then the last area of the last of the 5 pillars is advocacy. Many of you are aware of the Ottawa Convention, the activists who lobbied for the Ottawa Convention won the Nobel Prize, right? So this sort of advocacy at the international level, it's also, in my opinion, needed at the national level. So the subject that I'm addressing is about coordination. I want to say that I think there are kind of 3 aspects of coordination that I'd like to talk about. One is among NGOs and international actors, one is among government actors, and one is between NGOs and government actors. So you've got the internationals, the government, and then how they interact. Among the NGOs, there's a cluster system, and there's a subcluster on mine action. So they meet, and my office co-chairs that together with the UNDP. The international community NGOs meet on a essentially monthly basis, not always monthly. They also meet in Kramatorsk. I think the next meeting will be in Mariupol, to update each other on what they're doing. Now, in my experience, and I'm not a specialist in mine action, but what I've seen is that most of the people who work on mine action actually know each other, because maybe 5 years ago they were working together in Laos, and 10 years ago they were working together in Mozambique. They know each other. So the coordination among the NGOs is actually fairly smooth, and I'm really pleased to see how collegial they are. I think that, like any NGO, they compete for funds, but when they're doing the work, they seem to have a very easy way of kind of dividing up who will do mine risk education in one community and who will do it in another community. So the coordination among NGOs, I'm happy to say, I think is quite smooth. I should say that when we first started attending the subcluster meetings, to be perfectly honest, I was a bit surprised that there weren't any government representatives at the first meeting or two, because if you want to know who does mine clearance in Ukraine, it's the government. NGOs do not do mine clearance in Ukraine. They don't have they're not certified to do mine clearance. They can do mine risk education, they can do victim assistance, they can do advocacy, obviously. They can do survey, but they can't remove objects. They can't touch an explosive device under current legislation. If there's someone from an NGO here who has a different understanding of that, please share it. But my understanding is essentially you need a license to use explosives, to blow things up. In peacetime, you can't just go detonating anti-tank mines in a schoolyard, right? And there has not been a law or a regulation put in place that would allow, say, a private organization to actually do that. So in the subcluster system, I think largely at our initiative, I don't want to take credit for it, but we brought in the government actors. So now the subcluster meetings include all of the government actors as well. We pay for interpretation so that everyone can understand each other, and I think the subcluster meeting is more effective. Now, among the government actors, there are a few government agencies that have a role in mine action. The Ministry of Health, if you think of victim assistance, the Ministry of Education, if you think about minor-risk education, particularly in schools, the Ministry of Temporary Occupied Territories, which coordinates policy in Donbass, and then, of course, the agencies that actually do the clearance, which is the Ministry of Defense, the State Emergency Service, and if we're talking about IEDs, the police. The Ministry of Infrastructure, I think, still does demining, but they're turning over that function to the Ministry of Defense. So the national actors, I can say, also have a spirit of camaraderie. I mean, they have a good, a good sense of, it's a profession, it's a specialized profession. People who take mines out of the ground tend to have, deep respect for one another. It's a hazardous profession. It's kind of a brotherhood. And by the way, it is a brotherhood because Ukrainian law does not allow women to do demining. So this is also an issue that might be addressed at some point. But it's a brotherhood. But there are some policy areas that impede more effective coordination. What I can say is that for about 3 years now, we've been assisting the Ukrainian authorities in developing a law, a mine action law, that would allow for this improved coordination. We do not know the status of that law right now, I have to say. I can say that the version of the law that we were working on was rejected by the Rada. There was a second version drafted by a member of parliament. It was also rejected by the Rada. And currently the cognizant committee is drafting a third law. What would this law do? The law would, well, I don't know what the law will do, but the version that we were working on would create a central authority that would coordinate action by different actors, and it would create a mine action center that would do things on a very basic, a very practical nuts and bolts level. Just to give a simple example of what type of coordination might be needed, if one agency clears a mine, sorry, I shouldn't say minefield, because we're not always, if one agency clears a field, okay, where there might be unexploded ordnance or mines, another agency should do quality control over that field, okay? This is serious stuff, right? And so if an agency clears the field, someone else should check that to make sure that it's cleared. The government also needs to put in place guidelines for what degree of certainty is necessary. Do you need to clear a potato? I mean, again, this is outside my area of expertise very far, but do you need to clear a potato field to 1 meter and maybe a field for grazing to 0.5 meter? What are the standards? Do you need to clear a forest with the same degree of certainty that you clear a schoolyard? So these things are needed for coordination. And I referred to standards. So standards are needed for coordination. There are international mine action standards, just like there's international law, and then there's national law, but currently there are not national mine action standards. So the government needs to take the international mine action standards as a basis and then develop national mine action standards. So just as an example, when you are, now the international standards provide best practices and guidance, but decisions have to be made at a national level. Depending on a country's budget, they might decide for different types of clearance, okay? Depending on geographic conditions. I mean, obviously, the type of demining you would do in Ukraine is different than the type of mining you would do in Laos, right, which is a very, tropical, wet country with different soil conditions. And another aspect, another piece that's needed for improved coordination is a very specific GIS, that's a Geographic Information System database. It's called IMSMA. You don't have to remember that, but it's a consolidated database that will show what areas have been marked hazardous, what areas have been marked cleared, where there have been reported accidents. And this is essential when you have various agencies, when you have NGOs doing clearance. And I should also say that clearance, you know, we know quite well that clearance takes decades. It doesn't take years, it takes decades. Ukraine is still clearing objects from World War II. Every now and then, they find an object from World War I. Much more rarely, they'll find an object from the Crimean War. So clearance takes decades. I think Mozambique was recently certified as mine-free. It took decades to clear Mozambique. So I think a law is needed, you know, that would establish. Now, I should say you can establish an authority in a center without a law, but the path that Ukraine set out on 3 years ago was to do it via a law. Also, what we don't really see is sorry, just to back up. So the IMSMA system, we are putting it in place. It's partially in place. An area for coordination here is that the data that goes into IMSMA needs to be uniform. There are essentially questionnaires that people fill out and then put that information into IMSMA. There need to be standards followed. So if an NGO is reporting that an area is suspected of having mine hazards, they're using the same methodology that the government uses or that, say, another NGO uses. Also, I think that we don't really see a strategic plan, and I don't mean this as a criticism, I mean this as a factual statement. There is not a strategic plan for clearing priority areas. And we don't quite see a strategic plan necessarily for also marking. I guess just one other thing I should mention with humanitarian mine action, because it's so painstaking, and if you've ever seen a picture of it, I mean, you might have seen pictures or videos of people doing it. They're down on their knees with a metal detector and a thin metal rod, and they're blocking off. It looks like an archaeological site. They're blocking off, you know, meter by meter, and it's a very slow, meticulous process. So unfortunately, what that means is that you would not do that type of clearance close to the line of contact, because if the area might be contaminated again, you've wasted your effort. But in areas close to the line of contact, you can do improved marking, you can have common standards, you can do mine risk education. There are a number of things you can do to reduce the threat, even in areas where there are still active, or the possibility, I should say, of recontamination. Back further, though, from the line, in areas that are you know, less likely to be contaminated again, you can do clearance. Okay, so I guess the third area I was going to say was between governments and NGOs. I think excellent cooperation. I mean, I was very happy to see. I've been here since 2014, and so I've been here since kind of the humanitarian mine action has gotten stood up, and I can say that at first I was a little concerned that the national authorities would be maybe jealous of the international NGOs coming in with you know, fantastic equipment and brand new protective equipment and the cutting edge metal detectors. Well, they're using quite literally Soviet era equipment, which is functional, but it's heavy. You know, maybe the batteries don't last as long. It's difficult to do 8 hours, you know, carrying equipment that's 3 times heavier than needs to be. So I thought there'd be some jealousy, but I haven't seen that. I've actually seen that the government and the NGOs have worked extremely well together, and the Ministry of Defense and the State Emergency Service have been extremely welcoming, not just on a personal basis, but also in terms of ensuring that the NGOs can do their jobs. So that aspect of cooperation is quite good. But I would reiterate that a central authority and a central mine action center would create the organizational infrastructure to allow for this sustained cooperation that will need to last for decades before Ukraine can be considered clear of mines. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope that wasn't too detailed, and or maybe I left some things unanswered, and I'll be happy to take questions if there's time for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ehrlich. We are sure that this demining issue is one of critical importance for Donbass. I think today we will have another presentation of a military professor who is going to also talk about this, maybe not so strictly, but also, so this issue for Donbass, of course, is of big importance. So thank you for making a presentation on it. Dear colleagues, guests, the next presentation goes to Mr. Grigory Selishuk, who represents Ukrainian and Greek Catholic Church, who is head of the Committee on Migrants Affairs, and who is going to talk on the role and involvement of Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church and Caritas in humanitarian activity in Ukraine. Mr. Selishuk.
Thanks a lot for the invitation and for possibility to speak in such a high-level meeting. Actually, I'd like to start with some issues which our Bishop Vasil Tochipait already was pointing, and just a little bit to deepening this. Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church response on humanitarian crisis started from the very beginning. And definitely it was started first who were responding, it was actually parish communities, yeah, because they are the most flexible and who have the higher mobility. Actually, they organized different collections. They organized some shelters to host IDPs when they first were traveling from Crimea to Western Ukraine. Till now, up to 100 parishes are still very active in providing different type of assistance for conflict-affected people, but definitely their resources are much lower, much smaller, and from the March 2014, different church structures also were involved in assistance of conflict-affected people. Actually, and I'd like to remind these things, the first months assistance for IDPs were fully covered from local resources, especially in the Western Ukraine. And I think it's important to remember, and in the end, when I will come to my key messages, I will refer to this point. One of the biggest structure who is providing different assistance for IDPs and for conflict-affected people is actually Caritas Ukraine as a church structure. But we are not alone in this process. We really enjoy very strong solidarity from all over Ukraine, all over the world. And actually, it's done through the Confederation of Caritases, and we've got quite a lot of, first of all, technical assistance from different national Caritases, but also quite strong financial assistance. And this is not only from the means that the Caritases has, but they really involved quite a lot of assistance from government money. For example, CRS involved money from the government of United States, from Canada, Caritas Germany, Poland, Czech Republic, Denmark involved money from their governments, but also quite a lot of private donations came into Ukraine, and from some countries which we are not really have very strong connections to, like from Caritas Japan, or from recently we've got assistance from Caritas South of Korea. As also probably you know, Church is not only providing through assistance through all these structures, but a lot of collections were started in European countries. The biggest one, probably you know, this was by the initiative of the Pope, yeah, and His Eminence Nuncio is one of the key person for providing this assistance, but also quite a lot of national level collections for Ukraine were done. And actually altogether during this almost more than 4 years of work, Caritas provided more than 30 million US dollars assistance for people who suffered from the conflict, and it was covering more than 500,000 of these people who are really getting this assistance. Actually, on yearly basis, Caritas Ukraine is providing currently more than 100,000 conflict-affected people who are getting assistance. And definitely, first of all, we started, and the core of this is actually different types of humanitarian type of assistance. This is different relief packages, heating materials, multi-purpose cash grants or shelter repairs. And altogether this year we provided almost 35,000 of people with this type of assistance. But as you know, especially in the buffer zone, one of the key problems is actually healthcare. And also when we are looking through the humanitarian overview, this is one of the important sectors which are not covered enough. And that's why Caritas is also provide quite a lot of different vouchers and also assistance for medical infrastructure in a buffer zone to be stronger to respond on healthcare challenges for these people who are living there. And actually, through this type of assistance, we covered more than 10,000 people this year, till now. But we also understand that healthcare is very tight connected with the psychological well-being of the persons, and not only this type of challenges. We also see a huge needs really to develop different type of bridging of the people to each other. And I think that the role of the church is very key for this place, because this is a place when we can really look for reconciliation. And this is another field of the work of Caritas, where we are trying to establish a really world all over Ukraine assistance and activities helping people to reconcile with each other, to accept the situation they are, and also to reconnect with each other, also to adapt. So this is another field of our priorities and our future work. Another key issue is it's really to find a very strong connection between the humanitarian type of assistance and the building for the future for the people. Because what we also saw, and I hope that Mr. Ivane Bohorishvili can also help us to see that from year to year, financing of humanitarian type of assistance is really decreasing in Ukraine. And humanitarian response plan last year was covered about 20% or something, a little bit more, 25, 35. On different points. So also we understand that this year probably would be covered more or less on the same level, especially taking into consideration that this year the humanitarian response plan is planned only for 187 million, and last year it was 217 million, if I'm not mistaken. Thanks. So we see this actually decreasing of the assistance, and actually Caritas is also see this from year to year decreasing this solidarity or this support from all over the world. And I would say that Caritas Ukraine budget to provide the humanitarian assistance each year is decreasing about 20%, and probably next year would be the same situation. Even we see that the numbers of partners who are involving in the solidarity, who are involving into assistance for the people is decreasing, and we are getting new partners in this. Now I'm coming to short conclusion with three main key messages that I would like to bring your attention. First one, as you saw from couple presentation today, a humanitarian crisis is still here. It's not disappeared, and actually, if we are really look on the numbers, the crisis is becoming worse in some specific sectors, and this is very important to understand. Second message is actually attention toward crisis in Ukraine is also decreasing if you are speaking in the world, in Europe, but also in Ukraine. And I really like to use this opportunity that we have representative of the European countries' embassies here to point these things and to underline that for us it's very important pass the message about our situation in Ukraine, that still the crisis is still here and there is still a lot of people who are in need, and numbers are provided by the OCHA already. And the third message is becoming from our experience of helping needed people in Ukraine for these 4 years. And this is actually that if we provide to some people some simple type of humanitarian assistance, like food packages or something like this, we understand that we solve problem for a month, for 2 months or something. We are not really changing the situation of these people in many cases. That is why it's very important from the very beginning look for the linkages between the humanitarian assistance and development. And this is actually under the coordination of the OCHA in a humanitarian country team and in other coordination mechanisms. These messages are very often discussed and circulated. But this is something that for us it's very hard to go to also to main institutional donors who also hear these things, but who are providing this assistance. And in some cases we really had a kind of, I would say, stupid situation when we developed very interesting livelihood type of assistance in framework of the humanitarian project, but we need to cancel it because of the requirements of the donors, which is absolutely understandable, and we need to follow these things. So I think it's very high-level political question to discuss and to change toward Ukraine. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Mr. Serlishuk, for your presentation and for all the important work which Caritas is providing in Ukraine to help people. Dear colleagues, we have another presentation in this panel 1. It goes for Mr. Orest Suvalo, who represents Maltese Relief Service of Ukraine, with the presentation International Humanitarian Help in Ukraine, Project of Social and Psychological Assistance to Refugees from Donbass. Mr. Suvalo.
Thank you for invitation. Dear Excellencies, dear guests, dear colleagues, let me introduce you our project of Maltese Relief Service of Ukraine. We have a project of psychosocial support for people affected by the conflict in Ukraine, what began in January 2018 till June 2019. This project is supported by German humanitarian assistance through Malteser International and Malteser Relief Service of Ukraine, and is realized by our 2 big partners, it's the Kyiv Mohyla Academy and the Psychological Crisis Service, who has their people and their offices in the east of Ukraine. This actual project is the continuation of the previous project, which was in 2016-2017, and named, the title was Psychosocial Stabilization of the People Affected by the Conflict in Ukraine. During previous activities, we provided individual psychological, legal and social help support, individual psychosocial support, group work, training for specialists, roundtables, and other civilian activities. Now, in this new project, we have a little bit different, some changes in the points where it's possible to give some support and some activities. So, since 1st January, the center from previous project in Kramatorsk and Mariupol continue operating, and new center was launched in Shastya, Lugansk region. The mobile team who provided help in the villages near to the front line is working hardly, and we have a few mobile team from the psychological crisis service who work in Severodonetsk, Druzhkivka, and Volnovakha. They organize 4 visits weekly to village and small towns near the front line. Next slide, please. Between January and April, they visited 27 frontline villages and towns in Donetsk region and 8 in Luhansk region. In total, from this time, more than 1,500 residents of the frontline area were provided by psychosocial support by the mobile teams. So the work, we had 3 weeks ago, we had a visit with our colleagues from Psychosocial Crisis Service to Volnovakha, Granitne, Mariupol, and we saw the real work which is done in these activities. So they are trying to answer to requests from the persons who are living there, to their psychosocial states, to their some different mental health conditions. They have very close cooperation with mental health services in the region and in Kyiv. Through Skype, they receive consultation. They're trying to solve the problems with medication. And they try to do what is possible in this condition where people are staying. The local authorities and the social authorities, please next please, are very glad to see psychologists in their villages and towns, and they have a very big support to the professionals when they are giving some help in their territory. Also, the workers of our partners from Kyiv-Mohyla Academy and Psychological Crisis Service, they make a very large and big psychoeducational and other activities to show the problems, to show how the problems could be solved with their resources in their territories. A lot of round tables, a lot of printed articles were made by that time. For example, our partners from Kyiv-Mohyla Academy from the beginning of the year provided different activities, and you can see the numbers of this on a presentation. The peculiarities of this project is also that we not only give psychosocial support and support related with mental health, but also the first medical aid, first aid, and the trainers who provided psychosocial support, they also passed the trainings how to give first aid, and they are actively provided this in their area of their activity. Next slide, please. Representatives of our partners, organization involved in the project, they took and take part in the regular activities and meetings by mental health psychosocial support subcluster in Kyiv and in Mariupol. The last one was in 24 of May in 2018. Also, regional meeting is planning, so according to the mental health psychosocial support group, they are planning the meeting for the next 6 years, and we will continue to take active part in their meetings. Also I have to say that the partners, our partners from the project and the colleagues from subcluster took active part not only in the area of affected by conflict, but also in the development of National Mental Health Action Plan according to the mental health reforming by Ministry of Healthcare of Ukraine. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Suvalo, and for your presentation, and again for all the activity of Maltese Relief Service of Ukraine. Actually, all the presentations in this first panel were from the representatives of organizations who deeply work in humanitarian sphere in our problematic territories. Dear colleagues, now the floor is open for your comments, for your questions to our presenters, for your ideas related to the first panel in whole, or to, in particular, the presentations of our presenters. So please, you can freely take the floor, mentioning your name and maybe your job title. Please, the floor is open for your interventions, for a public discussion, let's say. Please.
If I may, would like to congratulate the organizers of this very important conference on convening all those interested in extremely important issues. And I would like to support, first of all, to comment on a number of the observations made, and then also to give some update information as far as the parliamentary perspective, especially within the domain of the responsibility of the Committee on Human Rights, which I'm a chairman of. The first observation has to do with a very valid point that while we are talking about sometime emergencies, some humanitarian emergencies, we are dealing with a protracted conflict. And the problematics of the protracted conflict, whether you take the dimension of the internally displaced persons, whether especially you have the nexus of the emergency and the humanitarian assistance and the development, I believe this observation needs to be taken seriously and have to have implications for the policies, both the governmental policies dealing with the protracted conflict, and that involves all the issues which is currently highly, if not neglected, underestimated, like housing, access to education, healthcare, labor mobility, and others. But at the same time, I believe the proper configuration and recalibration of the humanitarian assistance with all those institutions and organizations involved also needs to be taken into account. And that's a moving target, because the situation is not static. And for example, if you take the OEC statistic of the OEC SMM, last year there were more than 400,000 shelling, which is more than 100,000 more than in the previous year. So we have an escalation in terms of the situation with the shelling. The same concerns such issues which of course require special skills and, yes, legislative assistance, like the situation with the missing persons. By the modest accounts, those figures estimation available, we have at least 1,300 missing persons. And if you multiply it for the member of their families and the situations on the ground, that of course an issue which sometimes is underestimated. So the first observation, we are dealing not just with the emergency, while the emergencies are still present at the time of the escalation, we are more and more dealing with the phenomena of the protracted conflict. And then that requires, that calls for a different type of the policies that needs to be corrected. The second observation, I believe, has to do with the expectations and the need of much better coordination and sometimes even delegation of the responsibilities, and then supply and relevant supports from the governmental agencies where they are not, for various reasons, quick enough or present enough to delegate it to the well-equipped, reputable NGOs, those who already proved that they could be actors whose activities appreciated on the ground, has a reputation inside the country and internationally to deliver, where again, for various reasons, governmental agencies are too late and are too few. So this is, at least from the Committee on Human Rights, the lessons we are learning. Third observation, there are some leftovers from the period of emergencies that are somehow, either neglected or underestimated. If you take one specific example, the situation with the KPVV, the crossing points. There are from the very beginning, there were observations that they are not equipped enough. When there's some time, especially in the highest periods of crossing, the situation there inhuman, basically, especially if there is too hot or it's too cold. And there are still obvious needs to improve this situation that sometimes local authorities, when our committee went there twice last year, we visited Stanitsa, Luganska, Marinka, and others, they're saying we don't have resources to do this. The others having that we don't have a power to do it while we have resources to do. But that's something that should be fixed. Should be fixed. And it does not require major strategic planning. It does not require major resources. It just requires fixing it. And here, the first observation I have, the institutional element, as we are 4 years in the war now, and a number of speakers mentioned already the Ministry of Occupied Territories and the Internally Displaced Persons. The whole organizing idea of the establishment of this agency or ministry was to play a coordination role, and second, to be an originator, initiator of the policies, the governmental policy, and if needed, draft legislation that would help the ministry, the governmental agencies to deal with the situation. And let's ask questions, and I'm speaking very frankly here, to what extent this institutional element, the establishment of the ministry, which is more than 2 years old now in existence, changed significantly the situation for better? My answer as the chairman committee, it changed a bit, but is not what we expected and what people, the most important, were expecting. The first reason was too late in organizing, too late in making the staff, the personnel issues solved. Then the intra-governmental struggling with the other ministries, line ministries, most notably Ministry of Social Policy, of course Ministry of Finance, of course the Pension Fund, but as well as others. But it's all explanations that are, while could be valid, they're not answering the major issue. Because I don't believe that this type of the institutional changes that were meant to bring the real change on the ground, they should be allowed to be drifted by inertia. I think the major enemy as we're dealing with the protracted conflict is inertia. The things that are moving slowly, sometimes in the different directions, but moving, and then people are reconciled with this inertia. I think what is needed as far as the institutional element is concerned, a very fair, objective assessment. To what extent the establishment of the ministry, and there are some good people there, including the minister and a number of his deputies who are devoted, but the existence of this ministry didn't bring the change on the ground, which was the organizing idea of this ministry. And now I'm coming to the second part of my comments, is to what extent the parliament is a player and what needs to be done to strengthen its role. As far as the internally displaced person, which is not totally new phenomena for Ukraine, I would like to remind. Back in 1986, Ukraine for the first time witnessed the phenomena of the internally displaced persons. 116,000 people were moved from the Chernobyl area as a result of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. Of course, the cause of the displacement was different, but the type of the problems were quite similar. Now, first of all, we're dealing with a different source of displacement. It is war, violence. People were fled their homes because of the risk to their lives and the lives of their families. But also, we are dealing with the totally different scale of the phenomena. 116,000 back in 1986, and almost 1.7 million in the year 2018. 15, 16 times more. And if you take the dispersion of where those people are, for example, only in Kiev, 170,000, the Kiev city. The same figure, the Kiev Oblast. Most of them in the 5 immediate regions of Ukraine in the immediate proximity to the conflict zone. By the way, as far as the ratio of the IDPs from Crimea and from Donbass, the 99% from Donbass. That's also an important issue to deal with. And they're present also in the western Ukraine, in the central Ukraine, the southern Ukraine. So the IDPs, the parliament established the legislation, the basic, the framework legislation on the freedoms and rights of the internally displaced persons. That followed by the policy recommendations to the government as a result of the parliamentary hearings. Number 1 recommendations now implemented, namely the establishment of the ministry, dedicated ministry. But then what happened? We have the problematics ranging from the voting rights of the IDPs, which are not solved, and as you know, because of the peculiarity of the Ukrainian electoral system, especially as far as the parliamentary elections and the local elections, the IDPs are deprived of the voting, participating fully in full capacity in those elections, which basically the end effect disenfranchising of them from the life of Ukraine as the motherland, and ranging through the of course housing, education and health to the most urgent issues of the social payments, especially pensions. And what we have observed as the Parliament, and as far as the Committee on Human Rights, a very sad, to put it mildly, practice. When after adoption of the basic legislation, then we have a practice of the Cabinet of Ministers adopting bylaws in the forms of the resolutions of the governments that are adopted in contradictions against the basic law and sometimes against the Constitution, like in the case with the right to pensions, which in the European Court of Human Rights, pension is a property, and persons cannot be deprived the property that's rightfully and peacefully gained by the citizens. What we have now, we have a very humiliating procedure established to verify the IDPs of their conditions of living, depriving basically the policy and labor on the ground with the information on the statistics of the crossings and then the days that the person allegedly have been absent on the territory, on the residence where he or she claimed they live on, and based on this information provided by the Security Service of Ukraine, which should not be an actor in this process at all, then the local branches of the pension fund or the departments of the social policy, they're suspending the pensions. So, which is again an example, and I have in presence the Deputy Minister of Justice. He knows about this because he present in our committee. But despite of all these parliamentary hearings, committee hearings, policy recommendations provided, reports written by the Human Rights Special Monitoring Mission of the United Nations, Norwegian, Danish refugee councils, the Council of Europe, the still problem is there. There is, everybody likes the proverbs. One of the proverbs of my famous is the Finnish one. Why should not fix what is not broken? But this is a different situation. We have a the broken life process of the people, and that should be fixed. And for that, it does not require a pompous rhetorical speeches. It just requires simple following of the legislation. And especially in the case when we have a dedicated piece of legislation, the draft law 6692, which already in the pipeline in the Rada was cleared by the other committees, including the Committee of Social Policy and Labor, and it's still waiting to be put on the agenda for vote. 12 times at the at the Погоджувальна Рада, the conference of the presidents, I put it with the request to put it in the agenda. And all the times it was not the case, and the only real answer that has been provided by the speaker to me and by the first deputy prime minister, that unfortunately within the cabinet there are resistance, the cabinet of ministers resistance to put it, because allegedly it would require additional financial expenditures, which is totally wrong answer, because if we are dealing with the pensions that people deserved, they are part of the pension fund, they have to be paid. What we have now, a new situation, I would end at that, you may understand that I could talk about this endlessly, but what we have now, we have a court practices when the particular courts, including the Supreme Court of Ukraine, ruled already in favor of the citizens of Ukraine who were not paid. And now we expect, when the court practice is established, when the Supreme Court ruled on that, that we finally will have at least two fixes, quick fixes. First, to amend or to change the resolution of the Cabinet of Ministers on the social payments and bring them in correspondence with the basic law and the Constitution of Ukraine. And second quick fix, we are expecting to do that the law 6692 will be put on the agenda of the Verkhovna Rada and supported, because it will help these persons in need in the gray zone, especially in the buffer zone or gray zone, the IDPs, and also provide an opportunity decoupling the need to have ID certificate for the IDPs and the right to access to pensions for those Ukrainian citizens living in the territories that the government does not control. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your intervention, Mr. Namiria. Dear colleagues, maybe somebody else has comments or questions or interventions. If not, then we suppose that we can end our panel number 1. We can proceed to have a small and, I hope, present coffee break. And then we will proceed with panel number 2. So the panel number 1 is over. Thank you very much for your cooperation and input into the panel. We will, with our colleagues, we will show you where the place where the coffee break will Dear colleagues, first of all, we hope that you all had a pleasant time with a cup of coffee or a cup of tea or with our pastry, which we find a rather nice one. So we hope that this time was spent in pleasant talks and negotiations. And now we have time to proceed to move on with our panel 2 of our conference, which is called Cooperation and Mutual Relations of the Humanitarian Organizations Operating in Ukraine. In this panel we have 3 presentations, after which we will also have an open public discussion, an open floor for any intervention, any comment, any question to any of the presenters. And to start with, our first presenter in this panel is Professor Olga Butkevich, who is Professor of International Law in this institute and who is Vice President of the All Ukrainian non-governmental organization Ukrainian Association of International Law, which is an organization which represents all the specialists in international law all over Ukraine, in all the cities, in all the regions. And Ms. Butkevich will talk on the role of international community in combating grave violations of international law.
Thank you very much. And sure, I will be speaking about international law, surely. So to start with, I would like to draw attention to how modern international law was treated some 10 years ago, before the aggression of Russian Federation against Ukraine. And then I shall go to the role of international community in combating these crimes. It is rather typical for modern scholars to define a start of new period, named modern period of international law, from the last decade of 20th century. The factors causing the appearance of such new era are named as follows: the end of the Cold War, the end of the Cold War and the arms race, the collapse of the USSR and Yugoslavia, and as a consequence of these events, the transition from bipolar world to unilateralism and universalism in international law, and also the growth of economic interdependence of the world and countries, the process of globalization, formation of international law of the world community, which is the object of my speech, and also the turn of international law to homocentricity. As well as lawyers of the middle of the 20th century often exaggerated the role of the United Nations in the establishment of a new international law, lawyers of the end of the century considered the factor of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War as crucial one for beginning of the new period of international law, in development of international law. It's worth to note the position of eminent German international lawyer, Wilhelm Grewe, and he wrote, let me quote him because it's rather typical for international lawyers of that time to describe international law just in this way. So he said that the world changed completely between 1989 and 1991. The Soviet Union, one of the two superpowers, dissolved, leaving a collection of mostly medium-sized and minor independent states in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. The most important of these states were the Russian Federation and Ukraine. The Cold War faded away, and the United Nations Security Council was not longer paralyzed by the veto power of its antagonistic members, permanent members. The only stabilizing factor in this new world situation has been forceful pressure exerted by the United States, the only superpower to remain intact after the upheaval in Europe and the end of the Cold War. Although Russia did not leave the international policy arena, it was no longer able to compete with the United States in terms of influence. Let me quote some other international lawyers who exaggerated the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union in this case. According to the judge of the ICJ, Augusto Trinidad Cansado, in the last decades, one has witnessed a true conversion of the traditional and suppressed jus ad bellum into the jus contra bellum of our days. This is one of the most significant transformations of the contemporary legal order. Due to other lawyers, for example, American lawyer Douglas Johnston, the end of the Cold War restored the hope that major problems in international relations could be dealt with effectively through the peaceful process of international law and diplomacy. The peace maintenance of the United Nations owes its sudden resurgence in the 90s to two political phenomena: the rise to power of Mikhail Gorbachev in the Soviet Union and of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. The Russian government could no longer afford its superpower status and the cost of daily confrontation with the US. With the fall of the Berlin Wall and the disappearance of the East-West conflict, which had lasted for almost 50 years, the United Nations system, as designed in 1945, could be for the first time tested as to its possibilities. While binding decisions of the Security Council under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter were practically excluded during the East-West conflict, they have become a normal occurrence since 1990. So in these words we see that world changed completely and international law changed completely, but that was not true as about veto power and as about possibility of one of the permanent members of the UN Council to influence into international law and international legal order. Between various characteristics of modern international law, what is distinguished by almost all practices of this law is that the main feature of the modern international law is the formation of international or world community or international society as a determining factor of this law. At the beginning of the 21st century, major innovations were introduced in understanding of international society and the law functioning therein. The global law of human society erases boundaries between international law and municipal legal systems. The term international community, in the sense of international society, with a wide range of its subjects, including individual, is being used more often in the practice of the International Court of Justice. The concept of norms erga omnes as comprising obligations to all members of international community becomes more pervasive. International organizations, including NGOs, are gaining more important role. By the turn of new millennium, international lawyers had demonstrated the largely non-state nature of international law and non-state nature of the global community. The purely interstate dimension of international law has surely been overcome and belongs to the past. International legal personality has expanded so as to encompass nowadays, besides states and international organizations, also individuals, non-governmental organizations as true subjects and not only actors of this law and international relations. Even interstate conflicts, especially if they could potentially extend beyond the bilateral or regional level, are subordinate to the regularities of the law of international community. Moreover, modern international law is so dependent on the international community that most conflicts cannot be resolved without taking into account public interest or the influence of international civil society. The end of the monopoly of international personality of states and the expansion of such personality to at the universal level is a guarantee against the abuses of the past, and the state monopoly has come to an end even in such sensitive areas as the regulation of the legitimate use of force with the advent of the enforcement action under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. Several factors have had an impact on the recognition of the idea of humanity or international society, international community as the main actor of international law. First, the process of globalization and interdependence of countries and peoples of the world have shown that state has failed to manage effectively its functions as the main determinator of international law and international relations. International civil society appears to be better able to resist violations of international law than traditional governmental structures. Traditional means of such reaction expressed by the states are outdated in many cases. Some specialists even speak about a new phenomenon of financial humanitarian intervention, which shows it in freezing of assets and or other financial sanctions imposed on the violator of international legal obligations. Such financial humanitarian intervention arises from and based on mechanisms of the international civil society and other social institutions. During the period of classical international law, the state was in the center, having supplanted the human being. Global international law, on the contrary, places the individual in the center, and that is why international community consists of human beings as its subjects. Universal society, universal interest, and the universal rule of law are becoming new paradigm of modernity. And now let me speak about influence of international community and this new phenomena, the phenomena of the law of international community and its possibilities to resolve international conflicts and to combat violations of international law. Violation of the basic rules and the basic principles as well, the basic principles of international law by the permanent member of the United Nations and until recently one of the 8 most influential states of the world, the nuclear power, has brought the challenges to international law itself and to international community, and these challenges are the challenges of a new level. Russia's aggression against Ukraine, its preconditions and ideological support have not become something specific in history at the same time. Thus, the factor of loss of territory and imperial ambitions also were one of the decisive factors for the beginning of the Second World War. Similarly, the collapse of the Soviet Union gave birth in Russia a sense of humiliation or loss of original territories, brotherly ties. Not without reason, the official ideologies of this country openly began to justify Adolf Hitler and his policy of collector of lands, and they even call him the politician of the highest class. That is the words of Chancellor to the President of Russia, and politologists Andrianik Migranyan. According to him, the situation after the collapse of the USSR is as follows. Americans were not ready to integrate Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union into the new military political institutions, but on the contrary, they tried to weaken economically isolate Russia, and here he traces some similarities, and he compared this situation with the situation of the Second World War, probably justifying its those who started this Second World War. Under international law of the 20th century, interstate conflicts, especially if they can potentially expand on bilateral or particular boundaries, are subject to the law of functioning of international society or world community. Here we can say that international civil society and institutions, organizations of international civil society are even more able to resolve, to react to these challenges. By its nature, the challenge posed by the Russian aggression of 2014 is not addressed to a separate state, Ukraine namely, or to a group of states or a region of states. Here it is not important to commit a crime against one of the CIS member states or the member state of the Council of Europe or OSCE, Guam, or even a member of the United Nations. Here we face with violation of so-called erga omnes rules, which means that that crime is committed not against one state, not against a region, not against an organization. The crime is committed against whole international community. And that is the business of international community, and that is the thing and the task of international community to combat these crimes. With Russian aggression against Ukraine also, the world community has become hostage of its own idea of that state sovereignty is not an absolute. And with this homocentric ideas, surely very good and very progressive ideas, but at the same time, during the past decades, international law has developed in the direction of recognition of human being, not of the state as main value. And here we have some crimes against a state, and that is also that is the thing for international community to react to these challenges. Even the conflict in Ukraine shows that the most obvious violations, the most difficult challenges to international law lie in the field of human rights. And here the most effective organizations here in this case, the most effective reaction lies in the field of non-governmental organizations, or those organizations which are based not on state-centric, not on state interest, but on interest of human being. For example, here the role of International Red Cross, the Council of Europe, surely it's an intergovernmental organization. At the same time, this organization is based on individual, not on state interests. So they become more able to answer to these challenges, rather than they become more able than such purely intergovernmental organizations, for example, as the United Nations. So in this case, I would say that as far as current international law is based on international community and is often called as the law of international community, it is a deal of international community. It's a task for international community to combat these changes, and this community, this society is more able to do it than purely state institutions. So maybe somebody will have some questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Butkevich, for an interesting presentation and for mentioning this real transition to the law of international community in international law, which really is happening, and this is really important. And this is actually what we see when we talk about humanitarian relief, that in many cases NGOs or other organizations have a lot more powers to do something than a state. Thank you very much. Our next presentation goes to Professor Oleg Gushin, who is a professor in the Military Institute of Tarasa Shevchenka National University of Kyiv, who has a lot of experience in combating, I would say, crimes and in dealing with humanitarian assistance and humanitarian relief, not only in Ukraine. and he will talk about NGOs' involvement in humanitarian relief in Donbass.
Thank you very much. I'm Oleg Gushin. I'm holding a professor position in military university in two departments, departments of international military information and Department of Military Law. My presentation will be about NGOs' involvement in humanitarian relief in Donbass area. Just a couple of words about myself. I have 15 years of legal background in armed forces legal service. Right now I'm one of the liaison persons of from armed forces to NGOs involved in humanitarian relief in Donbass. As we know, all humanitarian work by NGOs is guided by 4 principles that were adopted by UN General Assembly resolution in 1991. There are humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. And I have to announce that all the NGOs officially involved in humanitarian relief in Donbass are working in compliance with these principles. My presentation will describe 3 NGOs. One of these is a Center for Civilian in Conflict, located in Washington, D.C., United States. And the first attempt in activity in Donbass in 2015, and just next year in 2016, they published the first issue and the first report, We Are Afraid of Silence. It's based on field research conducted in Ukraine between June and October 2016. This research examined actions by the various warring parties that impact civilians and how civilians perceive security forces' efforts at protection. This report recommends ways for the warring parties and the international community to address civilian protection needs. In 2017, the Civic published a next report. Unfortunately, this report is classified for the military officials only. Next, please. In 2016, in Warsaw Summit, NATO adopted a comprehensive protection of civilians policy, which based on experience of ISAF working in Afghanistan and related to the NATO's capabilities on civilian protections, harm mitigations, and ability to learn from these operations that have harmed civilians and adjust tactics. This policy will allow the alliance to work more closely with civil society organizations and to train alliance security forces to better protect civilians on their own. One of the most and the key issues of this policy is the level of protection of civilians is more higher than a general level described in international humanitarian law. Civic provides advice and expertise to NATO alliance and formulates its protection of civilians doctrine, participating in the development and coordination for a multinational exercise to test key protection concepts. This year, in April, Civic, and in collaboration with civilian CIMIC Operational Department of Armed Forces of Ukraine, organized the third international conference devoted to protections, to protection of civilians. And it was 2 panels in this conference devoted to protection of civilian policy drafting, the brand new protection of civilian policy of Ukraine, and to establish a civilian casualties mitigation team called CCMT, based on USA NATO ISAF experience in Afghanistan, and it possibly will establish and brand new joint operational staff in the Donbass area. I was leading the first panel in this conference, the protection of civilian policy drafting, and we described Ukrainian efforts to be a NATO member and decided that it should be a highest level official act like a president order. In this case, Ukraine will be the 5th state in the world with its own protection of civilian policy, and in this case confirmed the NATO values. The second, as I told previously, the second panel was described civilian casualty mitigation group or teams called CCMT, which first established in ISAF headquarters in Afghanistan, and it was very, very expressive way of dealing with local population. In case of establishing the CCMT groups will based on joint CIMIC center of joint operational staff with area of responsibility, the joint forces operation area in Donbass. The next NGO is Danish Refugee Council / Danish Demining Group. It's a private independent organization whose aim to protect refugees and IDPs. The key sectors of activities of DRC is protection, legal assistance, shelter, capacity buildings, etc. But one of the most important way of dealing with armed forces of Ukraine is protection of child. As you know, in 2011, the Ukrainian delegation announced a periodic report to the UN Committee of the Rights of the Child. And according to the final observation of this committee, Ukraine should in this year, in 2018, submit the following periodic report of the Convention of the Rights of the Child. Due to this aim, last year in 2017, there was signed a memorandum of understanding between Ministry of Defense of Ukraine and Danish Refugee Council with aim of cooperation in the field of child rights protection. According to activities, these common activities, the DRC will distribute to armed forces of Ukraine methodical and informational materials on the issue of protection of children in armed conflict, like this on the slide, which was given to all of commanders of battalion and higher, and conducting training classes to all military personnel and of armed forces of Ukraine, and providing professional advice to both civilians and military officials, mostly to the legal advisors and to CIMIC officers. Next, please. The part of the DRC is a Danish demining group, is a humanitarian mine action and armed violence reduction unit within DRC. DDG, so-called DDG, is widely recognized as a provider of efficient and community-oriented solutions to human security problems caused by mines and other explosive remnants of war. The key intervention of Danish demining group, you can see, is a mine risk education, capacity building, non-technical survey, and clearance support activities. Next, please. Currently running of DRC are the targeted mine risk educational training of trainers, non-technical survey operation in 6 regions closer to Donbass region, engage with capacity building of State Emergency Service, a national entity conducting mine action activities in all over the Ukraine. And next, DDG is designing, development, and piloting the innovative web portal and parallel SMS service that aims to improve the services provision and information exchange between conflict-affected people and the mine action operation. Next, please. And the last but not least in this short Oscar list is the Truth Hounds. It's a brand new domestic Ukrainian organization, firstly published its report in 2017, but as you can see, they started to work in the first year of war, and they decided to have a documentation of war crimes and crimes against humanity in Donbass and Crimea, especially in second part behind the enemy lines and the Donbass region. It means that all the people of Truth Hounds organizations are right now covered investigators and not published even their faces. We can see only the head of these organizations conducting all public experienced interviews, for example. As we can see, the Truth Hounds started worked in September 2014 as a field missions. And now, during its activities, this organization involved in the work of Council of Europe, European Commission's ICC. It means that all evidence is collected by Truth Hounds will go and right now go in like official evidences to the ICC, and in this case they are working with our military units, especially reconnaissance and intelligence military units in the Donbass area. Just a couple words about, next please, just a couple words about reports of the Truth Hounds organizations. It's we live like in reservations and dungeons speak. What life near the battle line is, and war crimes against prisoners and the effects of the presence of the Russian militaries in the Donbass. Next, please. And according to the previous work of Danish Refugee Council in conduct of protection of childs, the Truth Hounds published a report, a specialized report about No Country for Young, monitoring of attacks of children and schools during 3 years of war in Donbass. The report illustrates the situation with the children's rights violations during the armed conflict in the Donbass. So this is just only 3 examples of hard work of international and domestic NGO in Donbass area, but not only in Donbass and as well as Crimea Peninsula. And me, like a liaison person, are proud to announce that there are not only 3 NGOs, but many others. But according to the time, I'm explaining work on 3 on this. Thank you for your attention. I'm ready to questions.
Thank you, Professor Hushin, for this, I would say, a summary of organizations who do important job in Donbass. And we see that there are both Ukrainian and
yes,
international, though a lot more international than Ukrainian ones are there. And colleagues, we have another presentation in this section, in this panel, very important one, by Mr. Dmitro Matyukhin, who represents Evangelical Baptist Union of Ukraine, who will talk about the social ministry of the church during the war. Mr. Matyukhin.
Вельми шановний пане посол, партнери, друзі, студенти, хочу зазначити, я останній в програмі.
Your Excellency, dear partners, friends, dear students, I brought you a very good news. I'm the last one in this section.
Перш за все, прийміть щирі вітання від президента Всеукраїнського союзу євангельських християн-баптистів Антонюка Валерія Степановича.
First of all, I would like to extend sincere greetings to you from the President of the Evangelical Baptist Union of Ukraine, Antoniuk Valery.
Всеукраїнський союз церков євангельських християн-баптистів є найбільшою протестантською спільнотою в Україні, яка є рушійною силою в впровадженні нормативно-правових актів та активно реагує на виклики сьогодення, зокрема, які пов'язані з подіями на сході України.
Evangelical Baptist Union of Ukraine is considered to be the largest Protestant community in the country, being a driving force behind the implementation of legal acts, proactively responding to the challenges of our day, in particular those related to the situation in eastern Ukraine.
Станом на 1 січня 2017 року до Союзу входить 2272 церкви та 320 місіонерських груп, які об'єднують понад 113 тисяч віруючих, котрі свідомо сповідують і практикують основи віровчення євангельських християн-баптистів. Узагалі ж богослужіння в церквах Баптистського Союзу відвідують близько 300 тисяч осіб, які безпосередньо долучаються до різноманітних заходів, які організовує церква.
As of January 1st, 2017, the union includes 2,272 churches and 320 missionary groups that unite more than 113,000 of believers who willingly profess and practice the basics of the biblical teaching of evangelical Christian Baptists. In general, about 300,000 people attend worship services at evangelical Baptist churches throughout the country and are directly involved in church activities.
Перше, це волонтерська робота на сході України, зокрема в зоні АТО.
The first thing I would like to touch upon is volunteering work in eastern Ukraine in ATO zone.
З початком військових дій на сході України наші церкви активно відгукнулися на біду, організувавши в церквах збір продуктових наборів, медикаментів, одягу та предметів побуту для передачі військовим в АТО та мирним жителям Донбасу.
With the onset of hostilities in eastern Ukraine, our churches actively responded to the disaster, raising food and in-kind assistance, medicines and clothing for the military and affected civilians in Donbass.
Волонтерська робота для армії та мирного населення спонукала деякі церкви та об'єднання юридично зареєструвати низку громадських та благодійних організацій, фондів, щоб офіційно надавати допомогу військовим та цивільним громадянам, які постраждали від військового конфлікту.
Volunteer movement has prompted some churches and associations to register NGOs and humanitarian agencies in order to provide assistance to military and civilians affected by the conflict on a legal basis.
Є ряд організацій, які сьогодні продовжують ефективно працювати в рамках служіння соціального комітету Баптистського Союзу. Наприклад, громадська організація «Міський центр допомоги», яка проводить благодійну діяльність на території Сходу України.
There are national-based NGOs that continue their effective work to this day within the framework of the ministries of the Social Committee of the Union. One of them is an NGO City Aid Center operating a wide range of charitable activities within the territory encompassing the whole part of eastern part of Ukraine.
На сьогодні християнські благодійні організації надали лікарням сотні тонн медичного обладнання у вигляді гуманітарної допомоги, яка надходить з Америки, Канади та Європи. Серед набувачів допомоги такі медичні заклади, як обласна регіональна лікарня імені Мечникова, це місто Дніпро, Львівські та Северодонецькі військові шпиталі.
As of today, Christian charity organizations have provided hospital with hundreds of tons of humanitarian medical equipment originated from America, Canada, and Europe. Among the beneficiary parties are Melnikov Regional Hospital, Dnipro, Lviv, and Severodonetsk military hospitals.
Звичайно, гуманітарна допомога людям, які проживають в зоні АТО, зокрема так званій сірій зоні, залишається пріоритетом. Об'єм такої допомоги за останні 4 роки досяг 1000 тонн вантажів.
Without reserve, humanitarian assistance to local communities living in the ATO zone, particularly in the so-called gray zone, remains a priority for us. The volume of such assistance over the last 4 years has reached thousands of tons of cargo.
Важливою складовою у волонтерській роботі для армії є духовна робота. Адже так багато молодих людей, які потрапили в АТО, довго там перебуваючи, повертаються додому з психологічними відхиленнями та травмами, руйнуються сім'ї, зростає кількість самогубств серед військових. Церкви не залишаються осторонь та впроваджують групи душопіклування для бійців та ветеранів АТО.
An important component of our ministry to the army is spiritual work. We witness now many young people who served in the front line for a long time return home with psychological issues and injuries. Sadly, it often results in broken families. The score of suicides among military veterans is only increasing. The churches do not stay aloof and open counseling groups for the military and veterans.
Згідно офіційних даних, у Збройних силах України та Національній гвардії несуть службу, в тому числі і на передовій, 137 військових капеланів, біля третини з яких є представники церков євангельських християн-баптистів. Вони перебувають в частинах разом з бійцями та служать їм духовною підтримкою.
According to official figures, 137 military chaplains, with a third part of them represented by the Evangelical Christian Baptists, are serving in the armed forces of Ukraine and the National Guard, including front line of defense. They serve at military bases together with the soldiers and provide them spiritual guidance.
Духовна література стала невід'ємною складовою волонтерської діяльності на Сході. За декілька років війни вдалося написати та видати для військових цілий ряд спеціалізованих книг. Наприклад, для тих, хто отримав травми, хто має певні психологічні відхилення та на сімейну тематику.
Outreach through Christian literature has always been an integral part of our ministry in the Union. For the past years of the military conflict, a series of books for the military was published for those traumatized and maimed, those with psychological issues, and even on matters related to family health.
Друге – це місіонерське служіння на Сході.
Missionary ministry in the East.
Військовий конфлікт на Сході змінив життя сотень тисяч наших людей. В пошуках надії вони стали більше відчувати спрагу до Слова Божого, відвідують церкви, де їм також надають допомогу, продукти харчування, одяг, проводять спеціальні групи з духовного та душевного відновлення. Зараз наше братство проводить багато таборів, як зимніх, так і літніх, для дітей та підлітків зі Сходу України.
The military conflict has radically changed the lives of hundreds of thousands of our people. In search of hope, they feel thirst to the Word of God and start attending worship services, the churches. For their part, the churches extend a helping hand, offering food, clothing, holding groups for spiritual healing, and we hold many winter and summer camps for children and teenagers from the east of Ukraine.
Ситуація на Сході спонукає християн служити людям через медичну допомогу. Так, лікарі-християни від'їжджають в зону АТО та безкоштовно приймають сотні людей в домах молитви, які на деякий час перетворюються на поліклініки та безкоштовні аптеки.
Lack of access to medical services prompt Christians to minister also through medical aid, and physicians from among believers take trips to different locations in the ATO zone and provide and offer free medical assistance to hundreds of people. And for that time, for a day or two, the churches turn into polyclinics and free pharmacies.
Третє – це служіння сиротам та вдовам.
Ministry to orphans and widows.
Церкви євангельських християн-баптистів посвячено займаються сирітським служінням. Функціонує окремий відділ служіння сиротам, який проводить різні заходи, акції, надає юридичну гуманітарну допомогу. Ведеться інформаційно-консультативна робота щодо всиновлення християнами дітей-сиріт.
Our churches are committed in caring about the fatherless. We have a special department in our committee which is in charge of ministry to orphans. They hold various events, provide legal and humanitarian support. The department facilitates information and advisory services on adoption process for Christian families.
Держава активно залучає християн до участі в сімейному патронаті та наставництві для дітей з неблагополучних сімей. Християнами створено ряд громадських організацій в різних куточках України, які реалізують програми адаптації до життя в суспільстві, закладання моральних цінностей для випускників шкіл-інтернатів, дітей з неблагополучних сімей, молодих мам, які зазвичай є також випускниками інтернатів.
The state actively engages Christians to take part in family caring programs and mentoring for children from disadvantaged homes. In different parts of Ukraine, Christians establish NGOs that implement social programs for graduates of boarding schools or orphanages, children from crisis families, young mothers who oftentimes are graduates from boarding schools. These programs are aimed on adaptation of participants to life in society and building up moral values.
Наш соціальний комітет та відповідно церкви займаються служінням для вдів, чоловіки яких загинули в АТО. Організовуються зустрічі для вдів в різних містах України, особливо в прифронтових областях. Церкви надають вдовам продуктову та матеріальну допомогу. Однак, найголовніше, вони отримують духовну підтримку через спілкування, біблійне консультування, знаходять вихід та повертаються до нормального соціального життя.
The committee and the churches are engaged in ministry to widows whose husbands have fallen in the war. Special fellowship meetings for widows are held in different parts of Ukraine, particularly in frontline areas. Churches provide them with food and in-kind assistance, but most importantly, widows receive spiritual support through fellowship, biblical counseling, and eventually they find way and return to normal social life.
Також ведеться робота з дітьми, батьки яких загинули в АТО, через різноманітні табори та програми наставництва.
Ministry to children who lost their fathers in the war is also underway through various camps and mentoring programs.
Четвертий пункт для мене надважливий – це співпраця з західними місіями та організаціями.
Another point which is very important to me personally is a collaboration with international NGOs and missions.
Нині ми маємо ряд організацій, створених євангельськими християнами-баптистами, які співпрацюють з міжнародними фондами та організаціями. Зокрема, це Управління з координації гуманітарних питань ООН, УВКБ ООН, ПРООН, ЮНІСЕФ, Міжнародний комітет Червоного Хреста, Міжнародна організація міграцій та інші.
Today we have a number of organizations founded by evangelical Baptist Christians that cooperate with international foundations and organizations, in particular United Nations Office for the Coordination on Humanitarian Affairs, UNHCR, UNDP, UNICEF, International Committee of the Red Cross, IOM, and others.
Налагоджена співпраця з європейськими, американськими, канадськими місіями, які протягом 15-17 років проводили ефективну діяльність через проекти також у співпраці з національними недержавними громадськими організаціями. Основна мета таких проєктів – надання гуманітарної допомоги внутрішньо переміщеним особам та мешканцям Донбасу, допомога у відновленні житла, відшкодування витрат на житлово-комунальні послуги.
Cooperation was also achieved with European, American, and Canadian missions that have been implementing projects through 2015-2017 especially effectively, also in partnership with national-based NGOs, with the primary goal on providing humanitarian assistance to internally displaced persons and residents of Donbas, on restoration of damaged housing, cash assistance on covering rent services and utility bills.
Це особлива близька робота для організації, яку я очолюю, і яка майже 5 років поспіль проводить в життя гуманітарні програми в рамках співпраці з міжнародними організаціями та християнськими благодійними агенціями, націлені на підтримку внутрішньо переміщених осіб та жителів так званої сірої зони, які постраждали від конфлікту.
This part particularly relates to the organizations that I am leading. For almost 5 years, we operate humanitarian programs in cooperation with international organizations and faith-based charity agencies on supporting internally displaced persons and population living in the so-called gray zone.
Слід зазначити, що досвід та вплив міжнародних агенцій став дуже корисним у становленні та роботі національних громадських організацій і укріплення їхнього потенціалу.
It should be noted and highlighted that the experience and influence of international agencies became useful in establishment and operation of national NGOs, thus building up their capacity.
Немає змоги детально говорити про інші напрямки діяльності. Зазначу лише, що соціальний комітет Баптистського Союзу також здійснює тюремне служіння, духовну роботу з людьми, які мають обмежені фізичні можливості, людьми, які мають залежності, для яких створено низку християнських реабілітаційних центрів, надається допомога безпритульним та інше.
Due to time limit, I cannot talk about other areas of our ministry in detail. I just note that we also carry out prison ministry, ministry to people with special needs, physical needs, people with addictions, who can undergo programs at Christian rehab centers and assistance to homeless.
Хочу зазначити, що за останні роки було започатковано цілий ряд програм та ініціатив, які направлені на зміцнення християнських цінностей, зокрема популяризація щасливої родини, яка будується на біблійних засадах.
I also would like to highlight that in recent years there has been launched a number of programs and initiatives aimed at strengthening of Christian values through promotion of a concept of a happy family based on biblical principles.
На завершення хочу сказати, що євангельські християни-баптисти – дуже відповідальна спільнота, які прагнуть, щоб Україна стала насправді квітучою мирною країною і докладають максимум зусиль, щоб зробити її такою. Адже в Біблії сказано, що поки маємо час, треба робити добро. Цей вірш став лозунгом соціального комітету Союзу баптистів.
I would like to close with the words of firm conviction that the evangelical Christian Baptist churches are striving to see Ukraine a prosperous and peaceful country and do their utmost for that. As the Bible teaches us, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people. A verse that became a slogan of the Social Ministry Committee of the Baptist Union of Ukraine.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Matyukhin, for talking about the important social ministry of the church during the war, during the armed conflict. And we really see that during these 4 years of armed conflict, and the fifth has begun, really the churches are the most active organizations who help people in the zone of armed conflict. So this is very true. Thank you very much. Dear colleagues, dear guests, now our panel 2 came to an end. So please, the floor is open. If you have any questions, any comments, any ideas, any interventions, please, you can freely take the floor and comment or ask or intervene on any of the related aspects. If everything is clear for us, then maybe we give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Ambassador to close maybe formally our conference.
Dr. Korinevich, it is correct? Thank you, thank you. You are a brilliant moderator. You are able, you have the capability to underline and to emphasize and to summarize the main passages of every speech in a very smart way. Thank you for your collaboration. And I hope that this can be only a step in a more articulated path to have constantly a comparison among our experiences on the ground, to do more and more a better job for this ancient and great country. The best wishes for your work, and let me say just a word in Italian, the official language of the order. Grazie.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. On behalf of the Institute of International Relations, just 1 minute, maybe even less. It's a great honor and pleasure to hold the conference jointly with the embassy. We are very thankful for cooperation, for fruitful collaboration. We hope that these events are really important and are another steps in providing assistance to the people in need. Thank you very much for all the help which the order gives to Donbass, to the people in need in Ukraine. And the Institute is always open to any incentive, any initiative which deals with the human rights protection, humanitarian assistance, humanitarian relief. So we are open to further fruitful cooperation, and we hope that this is only another step forward in this. So on behalf of the Institute, dear colleagues, thank you very much, everybody of you, for your kind attention to our conference. The conference is over, and we want to have some common photo with Mr. Ambassador, so please spend some more minutes with us. Thank you very much. Have a nice day, and let the God bless you. Thank you.
They have to pay for the photo, for the pictures, eh?
Thank you very much.